When everybody was like, okay, who's going to talk about rules and regulations, I was out of the room when the vote came down, and I came back. So again, I'm Darrin Kimbler with UW Extension. I am not a regulator. I am an educator. So if the regulator comes to you and says you shouldn't be doing this, don't say Darrin said you could, because Darrin isn't qualified to say that. So I'm going to talk primarily about Wisconsin state regulations. So I will talk about federal, and I'll talk briefly about Michigan, because I live in Michigan, I work for the state of Wisconsin. So, how many Wisconsin? We got a few. Okay, we're about half and half Wisconsin, half Michigan. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about food safety regulations with maple syrup. I'm going to talk a little bit about environmental regulations with maple syrup. We're going to talk a lot about food safety with maple syrup, I should say, because that's where the regulators are most concerned about, is food safety. And we all should be, Fortunately, maple syrup in its production makes it a low hazard food, because we do two things. We cook it, and we cook it for a long time. And more importantly, we reduce the amount of water we increase. By increasing that sugar content, we also make it much more shelf stable. So, regulators are actually not nearly as concerned about maple syrup as they say are about milk or, seafood. Seafood, shellfish scares them quite a bit. So, what we have is, in the state of Wisconsin, the main agency that is governing maple syrup production is the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, or DATCAP. The rules that they go by were set out, by statute, and they are administrative rules: 70 for food processing plants, 75 for retail food establishments, and 87 for honey and maple syrup. So honey and maple syrup have their own rules. Depending on the level or the size of your operation, the others may apply to you. So this is what I worked out.
Very good.
I've made this. This is actually going to be a producer survey that you can do online. That's not nearly as complicated. This is going to ask you some basic questions and kind of give you an idea of what regulations apply to you. So this is for both states here. If you are just making it for yourself, no regulations apply.
All right.
Okay. If you give yourself food poisoning, the states of Wisconsin and Michigan are perfectly fine with it. If you give it to your family, they're fine with it. It's only when you start getting money for your product that they are concerned then about who's getting sick and so forth. But even that, if you are a direct sales, if you're doing direct sales where you see your customer, they're actually, and you're under a certain dollar amount, and in Wisconsin it's $5,000, in Michigan it's $15,000. The states are pretty much saying we're not going to regulate you, or not regulate you strongly. If you're doing a couple things, you're selling your own syrup that you made, not your neighbor's syrup, and you're not selling any other food items that could be potentially hazardous. So if you're at the farmer's market, or you've got a roadside stand or whatever, and you're selling it, the states are pretty good about saying, okay, you're going to know your customer. If they were to get sick, they would know exactly who got them sick or potentially got them sick. Because most of the time, they just happen to have maple syrup on whatever that was, could cause them to be sick. If you're selling more than that amount, then you're going to need to get, if you're going to sell over that dollar amount or you are selling other things, you have to get a retail food license, just like any other store that sells food products. So if you're selling direct and you're selling under a certain dollar amount and you're selling your own stuff, you need to label it. And Michigan in particular requires that you label it like you would a cottage food item with your name, your address, and with a label saying this was produced in a facility not inspected by the state. All that information is online in both states. Where they really get concerned is when you're selling it through someone else. So you're a wholesaler. Because then regulations are set up kind of to be able to track back where a problem may have started. So when there's that big recall of hamburger, the reason they're doing that, they're going back through, there's chains and lots of meat that's being produced, and so they can say this lot is bad, so all of that. So that's what they're trying to do with maple syrup. So if you're selling to another processor, or you're selling to a store that's going to sell it, there's a good chance that you may have to register with the state, especially in Wisconsin, and you may have to get a food processor license. And there are dollar amounts, again, that affect whether or not you need to get that food processing license. If you are a Wisconsin producer, they have a maple syrup producer's handbook. If you're selling over there, if you're a Michigan producer and you're selling in Wisconsin, you're still going to need to get that information. So if you want to grab some, I don't know if I may not have handed enough out. I think just one for you guys. And here we go. Thank you. Oh, there we go. So I'm working with the department right now, the Department of Ag, to actually get this online survey. So it's just, you can answer a few simple questions, and then you'll know whether or not you need to contact DATCAP to get the licensing process started. There are licensing specialists in the department that you contact, and they will work with you individually to get your facilities with the proper licensing. So that's what I usually, I'm trying to direct people either you don't need to worry about this, or you should be contacting this licensing specialist who's going to be able to make sure you get everything set up right. If you're thinking of going commercial and you're thinking about building your, a bigger sugar shack or remodeling your sugar house, contact them first, because that's going to allow you to not get when the inspector comes out, not get a big surprise of how you didn't set it up right. So, this is where I'm a big believer in the ask for forgiveness instead of permission category, except in this sort of these cases, because it can be very expensive to in the situation. So. Yeah, I don't expect anybody to understand this. I barely understand it. But this was the backbone for me to build this online survey. In fact, the DATCAP the guys who wrote this had a hard time understanding this. I felt kind of proud, actually.
I was going to say, that looks like plumbing in a basement.
My guess is your plumbing hasn't been inspected.
Not officially.
Starting in 2021 in Wisconsin, if you are using a reverse osmosis machine, you will likely have to get a low impact discharge permit. And they say it's a low impact, meaning it's not going to require that much effort. I've got the draft permit here. Even though RO water is essentially distilled water, if you're a big enough operation and it goes into a small stream fairly quickly, it's not just infiltrating in there. It's very low oxygen, and it can cause kills in small streams. So Wisconsin is concerned about this. Michigan does not have this rule. I don't see them making this rule anytime soon. You don't go into effect this year. It's because it's still in the public comment section. It has been pulled back about 3 times to be rewritten. So just something for people to have on their mind. If you're in Wisconsin, you plan on using an RO, starting next year, the DNR, and this is Department of Natural Resources, not DATCAP, may require you to get a groundwater discharge permit. It's very new. I know the Maple Producers Association of Wisconsin has been working really hard to make this easier on, because this is not just for maple syrup producers. This is a general low impact discharge. It's not strictly for maple syrup. So they've been helping them write the maple syrup side of things. So they've made it a lot easier. That's why it's been pulled back 3 times. Teresa can give you more information about what the association has been doing with that. And I was saying I have a little bit on Michigan. Maple syrup and honey are part of the Public Act 92 of 2000, Michigan food law. And producers who are under $15,001, you have that extra dollar there. I don't know why. You essentially more or less follow the cottage food law as far as labeling. Like I was saying before, the label is pretty simple. It's the producer's name, the address, contact information, any potential allergens, which maple syrup really doesn't, and that sticker, that disclaimer that this was produced in a non-inspected facility, not home kitchen like you do with cottage food, but facility, because if you're selling out of and cooking in your house, you probably don't have paint on your walls anymore. The steam will have taken it off. If you go to $15,002, then you're starting to talk about and by the way, this is also for wholesale and retail. So if you're selling it at the local store, Michigan doesn't care, as long as it's got that label on it. If you're selling over that, Michigan is going to require you to get a food processing license and or a food establishment license. So you're going to really probably be ramping up your operations considerably to hit that 15,000. I would love to see everybody doing more than 15,000, but I think our crowd right now is a few years away from that. That's why you do multi-generational, right? You plan out. And the new kid on the block, in 2011 or 2009, in response to the 9/11 attacks, actually, food safety became an issue in the United States. And Congress passed the Food Safety Modernization Act in 2009. They are just now getting it into full swing on requirement. But this covers every aspect of food, includes not just human food, but also pet food. So this is a very large law, a very large act. I went through produce safety. That's a whole different world. Where it really affects maple syrup production is in the preventative controls rule. And for most everybody here, this is not going to be an issue. In fact, I'm almost certain almost all of you, it's not going to be an issue because you don't reach those thresholds. Again, they have dollar thresholds, they have direct market thresholds. University of New Hampshire Extension made a simpler chart than my chart to help navigate the the FSMA rules. Essentially, what it comes down to is whether or not you have to have a food safety plan in place. If you are required to under the preventative controls rule, there's steps on developing a food safety plan, and that's like recall plan, your facility, how that's set up. So this is more of a high level food safety law. The states are the ones that are really doing more of the ground, on the ground food safety day-to-day stuff. So I'll give you this here. They have an online tool that's more specific than this one. But again, if you're getting to a certain size, then you'll definitely want to keep this in mind. There we go. Yeah, you can go ahead and take. I mean, this is how high level is. If you're under $500,000, most likely you have some kind of qualified exemption, because that's where they're starting at. They're looking at much bigger processors and producers than the maple syrup industry does. There's a few maple syrup industry people that are affected by this, but they are very large. Not so many here in this building today.
That's 250,000 taps. Just to put it in perspective.
Yep, and we have and Michigan, both Michigan and Wisconsin have a couple of producers like that. But it also affects guys who buy sap. There's a lot of people that buy sap in quantities like that. So it affects them more than it affects you guys. I put it out there because we all have to be cognizant of it. They did actually go, and there was an amendment to this to actually take the burden off of small producers. Before the amendment was on there, this affected everybody equally. And as small farmers rose up, because it was mostly going to adversely affect small farmers, but they came in with these sort of income and market rules. All right. It's not a great topic to talk on. So I left plenty of time for questions because it's confusing and it's convoluted sometimes, but it's better to be ahead of it than behind it, especially if you're thinking of scaling up, because if that's the time to actually put these practices into place. If you plan on staying a hobbyist or just selling to the family, again, this is not going to affect you too much. It's when you're taking that next step, especially if you're selling sight unseen to a destination.
So, Wisconsin is $5,000 or less. And you're recommending, say, I'm the producer, I'm selling directly to my neighbor in a farmer's market.
Right.
But say you're at a farmer's market, you can only be selling maple syrup, or could you have other?
You can sell at the farmers market, and again, you have to double check. If you're selling direct, and you're selling other non-hazardous food like fresh fruits and uncut fresh fruits and vegetables, you would be exempt. If you were selling baked goods, now that you can at farmers markets, then you potentially might have to get a food processing, or not a food, but a retail food license.
Were you asking if the combined?
If say you were selling.
It's selling the maple syrup gross.
Plus you're selling, say, some lettuce or broccoli or
Right. Yeah, and it's just the gross on the maple syrup sales, not the combined sales. So if you were selling lettuce and that puts you to $5,002, then you would still only be counting those maple syrup dollars.
What is the step in Wisconsin once you hit that 5,000 mark?
Then you're going to be looking at either a retail food license or a food processing license, and or both, depending on because you couldn't see up there. There's that I've got that you're a wholesaler and a direct market sales, and then it becomes very confusing. That's where I've been working with DATCAP to get the language simple enough for an online survey that you know they tend to use the legalese of the statutes, and I'm like, well, can we make this into language that it in one or two sentences? Pretty much, again, all I'm trying to do is the survey is if you need to get a license, you call the licensing specialist.
That would mean your facility becomes state inspected.
Right.
And at that point, you could wholesale.
You could wholesale. Yep.
Just as easily.
Right. So in that handbook, it gives you, and there's a lot of exemptions. You know, he talked about the toilet and all that stuff. There are variances that you can get for the outhouse and the wash stations. A lot of times it's the local health inspector that comes and does that, and not the state. But the state did about 200 sugar bush inspections last year in the state of Wisconsin. So there's a lot more out there than I thought. So, other questions? Again, yes.
How long is it going to take before Michigan beats up Vermont in top maple syrup producing?
Have you seen the numbers?
I heard that if Michigan really...
I look at it this way because I look at more where the forest is. If you take northeast Wisconsin and the western UP, we have potentially vastly more resources than Vermont, and we're bordering on having the resources of Quebec. The densities here, the thing is our forests are young compared to those. You got to remember our forests were cut over a lot later. I mean, they're on their third or fourth generation of forest out east. That's historically been one of the reasons we've been far from markets, and our forests are still relatively young overall. Our maple forest in particular, we've had the aspen and birch that came in after the cuts, and they've kind of now petered out, and the sugar maples are now starting to take over. When we get some major investors in here, I think I just heard that on the eastern UP, they just put in 100,000 tap operation. Wow. The guy had never made syrup before. He's just an investor. The potential is here. The markets are strong for maple syrup. As he was saying, the growth is still going, and unlike a lot of other commodities. So this part of the, Gogebic County and Iron County are a bullseye for like the densest maple forest in the world. You pull up the USDA forest cover maps, it's, we're just dark. And you look over, and I've pulled out the basal area of different states of sugar maple, and we're by and far bigger than Vermont. So Michigan's got to get ahead of Wisconsin first, because Wisconsin's fourth, Michigan's fifth. But combined, they're still... if we lumped them together, they still wouldn't be anywhere near Vermont. I lived in Vermont for a couple of years. I mean, it's in the identity of Vermont, and we got potential, and that's part of the reason we're doing this. As Extension, we identify these assets that we have in our communities, and we try to get people to promote them and excited and educated about them.
They don't really market the area, though.
That's part of it. That's where the identity, Vermont probably makes about as much in agritourism for maple syrup as they do the actual sap. When I lived out there, bus loads of people would would stop at the sugar shacks from New York and New Jersey, and they would buy bottles of syrup and some candies, but they'd be buying all kinds of other, anything you put a maple leaf on, they would buy. So, so that's part of it too, is developing the identity of maple. And that's where Amy, my colleague, and I are working, is also helping. I don't know if you got the save the date, but this Maple Festival we're going to have in Hurley. Again, that's building that identity of as a maple producing area and a place known for its maple.
Can I ask?
When is that?
Yeah, when is that?
It's April. Did you not get a card?
Yeah.
Oh, is that this?
Yeah.
April
Oh, that's on the table.
Yeah, we kind of started a little bit last year. We had the restaurant challenge, restaurant and bar challenge. This year it's going to be expanded out a little bit more, be a full weekend. So last year I ate myself through all of the contestants. Whew. There was some great food, but I might have hurt myself. Any maple more regulation questions?
Is there any collaboration between, well, I don't know sort of regulation, but collaboration with the county forests or state forests to maybe develop some of their lower grade?
So that's a good question. So I don't know if you saw the poster we had in the Commons there with the Ottawa.
Yeah.
Okay. For personal use, you can actually do it on the Schwamigan Nicolet. As far as Gogebic County, I don't know about county forest. It's something that could be, needs to be discussed more. I have had some discussions with the Iron County forester. He's open to it somewhat, but I mean, it requires the county boards to approve any kind of changes to land use like that. I think we're early right now. But I think it's a great opportunity to hit some of those places where timber may not be the best quality or its access.
I think I got 2 points on that. First of all, county forests are basically under state control, no matter how you like it. They are under state control. So we would actually have to get a state utilization variance on that because of the certifications that the forests are under. Second of all, I would argue that there is actually could be more money generated annually on sap production versus everybody's veneer production in their minds, that they're ruining these beautiful sugar maple trees by drilling holes in them. Well, I've seen the numbers, and the sawmill people just say, yeah, we're in second place.
No, it's definitely true. You get an annual rent off your taps. And I always tell people, because I'm also working with foresters to retrain a lot of our foresters around here, because they're very much focused on timber, and it's hard for them to manage for sugar bush. The easiest answer I have for that is no more than 10% of your maple trees are ever going to be veneer quality. Put a big ribbon around them and don't tap them. Tap all the trees around them, and when
just don't tap 4 feet above.
yeah. Well, to be honest, with some snowpack years, you may have to dig down to get 4 feet. But it's easy enough, and then you factor that into you're going to be doing stand improvements. You time that to when your tubing comes needs to be replaced. That's when you go in, you pull out those veneer logs, and it'll work out. Just make sure you don't have some crazy kid out there with a drill tapping everything, maple or not. But yeah, I think there is great opportunity for rents on county and state land. And again, it's an annual thing where you're not waiting for a cut cycle to come around.
I think what you would be able to do is basically most counties have ball cutting permit, balsam ball cutting permit, same thing. The only difference is that if somebody like these gentlemen over here want to set up a tubing system on the county forest, you know, they have that liability of investing that money. Now, you know, they're in probably a 10-year program, you know, on the county forest, and somebody goes in there and cuts all the lines because I don't wanna look at that.
I don't wanna look at blue
crap
lines.
while I'm deer hunting or whatever, you know, and now who's.
No, they've had that problems in other places like Vermont too.
Yes. Well, they don't have any deer in Vermont because they don't manage their forest for wildlife.
Oh, trust me, they have deer, but what they have worse, they have
I just came from upstate New York. They don't have shit.
well, where I was living in Vermont, they seem to have too many because what they have there is they have errant snowmobilers going through the mountains, and they wind up collecting a lot of blue tubes across there.
In my opinion, it's definitely just a mindset that we have to overcome.
Right, and that's talking with your county forester, getting it in their ears. It won't happen overnight. Nothing does. But in the meantime, we can be developing on the private lands, and as those private lands become less accessible, because there's opportunities to rent taps from people. You set up, like he said, like Joe said this morning, you can, there's plenty of people who don't live here, want to make a little rent on their lands, and you can lease taps, and you just get, if you're going to put tubing in, you get a 10-year contract, so that if they don't want to go forward, it's time to pull the tubing anyway.
I think it would be a great opportunity for, let's say, a county forest and somebody that has a little forethought to sit down and say, okay, if the county maintained or retained the tubing, if they actually did the initial investment and then they ended up selling the sap, but they utilized, let's say like this school here is building their evaporator and so on and so forth. If they utilize cooperative labor, and upkeep, I think it could be a great
opportunity.
generation for, generating a lot of, work ethic and monetary value and so on and so forth. But again, you need a bunch of people thinking outside of the box, and in the state government and county government, which I am a member, I'm on the Lincoln County Board, you find very few of those people. Most of those people are in the box that's duct taped up.
Yep.
So
No, not Lincoln County.
Yeah, and that's actually something, we're actually talking with here is a lot of school districts have school forest, and utilizing school forest as sugar bushes for either education and or for income, for the school district as well, because a lot of times these school forests, if they're not been planted in pine plantations, is a great opportunity to get out. And so I've been talking with Roger and them about potentially, working with them on that as well.